Hello everybody, welcome to this webinar. I am Dr. Stephen Elliott. I work at the Biology Department of Chiang Mai University and I am one of the founders of the Forest Restoration Research Unit of the university, and we are located in northern Thailand. Just to let you know before we launch into the lecture proper that the material of this lecture is based very closely on chapters 3 and 5 from this book. It's called Restoring Tropical Forests, a Practical Guide, which came out earlier this year. I wrote it with Dr. David Blakesley from Wildlife Landscapes, which is a British environmental consulting agency, and Dr. Kate Hardwick, who is the main organizer of the ecological restoration activities at Kew Gardens. You can download the book, you can view it on a screen, or you can print it out from our website, which is in orange on the screen in front of you. If you want to hold a physical copy of the book, you can order it from Kew Publishing, who is the publishing agent of the book. It's also on Amazon and numerous other book-selling websites. So the title of my lecture today is Plotting a Pathway Towards Restoring Tropical Forests. And what I'm going to be talking about is the various stages of degradation that can be recognized in tropical forest ecosystems and the appropriate restoration response to each of those stages of degradation. So I don't think it's necessary to explain what a problem deforestation is. I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with the impact of deforestation on biodiversity, the fact that deforestation contributes almost a quarter of the carbon dioxide emissions around our planet, and the fact that deforestation can cause floods and droughts and removal of the supply of forest products to local communities. I think these are things that you're all likely to be very familiar with. So the question is, if deforestation is such a huge problem, then obviously reforestation is the solution to this problem. But not like this. This is a plantation of Pinus yunnanensis in Yunnan province in China, and as you're looking at this slide, you can see, first of all, there's only one species of tree here. This is not a forest ecosystem. This doesn't have any of the biodiversity of the original forest ecosystem of this area. All the trees are the same age, so there's not much in terms of diversity of structure. The crowns of the trees are all in the same place because they're all the same age, so they're all competing to absorb carbon dioxide and light from the same strata above the ground. This is a very inefficient way to get trees to absorb carbon dioxide and grow well. These trees are all effectively competing with each other. If you look on the ground, there's almost no understory and very little in the way of ground flora. This is not a forest. This is a wood factory. It's fine if your objectives are to make wood or wood products, wood chips and paper and so on and so forth. But nobody should look at this as being a forest ecosystem. So reforestation is a very broad term. We have to be very clear about our terminology here. It means the re-establishment of any kind of tree cover. It includes commercial plantations like the pine plantation that we've just seen. This is another one. This is eucalyptus in Thailand. Agroforestry, which is very much a commercial kind of forestry as well, where agriculture and forestry are mixed. Community forestry, another form of forestry primarily designed to yield a steady stream of a variety of products for the use of local communities and for the selling of local communities as well. So where does forest restoration fit into all of this? Clearly, forest restoration is a particular and highly specialized form of reforestation. What we are trying to do is to recreate something similar to the original forest ecosystem that would have grown in whatever site we are restoring before any kind of forest degradation occurred. And we've come up with this several stage definition of forest restoration. We think it's about directing and accelerating ecological succession. So it's based on ecological succession, making sure that the natural processes of ecological succession go in the direction towards the kind of forest ecosystem that we want to restore, and we call this the target forest ecosystem. And like I said, it should be similar to the type of forest ecosystem that would once have occurred on the site before deforestation occurred. Making sure it goes in the right direction and accelerating ecological succession, making it go a little bit faster than it would happen naturally. If your aim is simply to make ecological succession go at the same rate as it would naturally, then you're not really doing anything. So we want to make sure ecological succession goes in the right direction, and we want to speed it up. Directing and accelerating ecological succession towards an indigenous forest ecosystem. Indigenous means native. So we're not talking about exotics here. An indigenous forest ecosystem of the maximum levels of 4 parameters. And these are the 4 parameters we're looking for. First of all, biomass accumulation. The maximum amount of biomass accumulation. This means simply that the trees are going to grow at the maximum possible rate that you can get them to grow. Biomass accumulation, of course, is important because 50% of the biomass of a tree is carbon, and if you're interested in doing forest restoration for carbon sequestration, you've got to get the trees to grow as quickly as possible. The second maximum parameter we're looking for is structural complexity. Of course, as the biomass accumulates in the ecosystem, then that biomass becomes partitioned amongst more and more structures. Small trees have small stems and small branches. Bigger trees have strata, create strata within the forest ecosystem. They have bigger root systems. On bigger branches, epiphytes can come in, and this creates the third thing that we're looking for, which is niche space. There we are. We've got some niches going there. We've got some animals coming in. So structural complexity leads to more niches, and these niches can be filled by more species. So your overall biodiversity goes up, and it should go up faster than would occur naturally. Biodiversity increasing naturally leads to interactions between those species, interactions between plants and their herbivores, between predators and their prey, and so on and so on. So ecological functioning should also go up. So forest restoration is about increasing or maximizing the values of these 4 parameters, and they pretty much lead on from each other. Biomass accumulates, the biomass becomes partitioned and becomes structural complexity. Structural complexity creates niches. The niches are filled by species. This is biodiversity recovery. The species interact with each other. That is ecological functioning. So we are trying to maximize the values of those 4 parameters to levels which are self-sustainable within climatic and soil limitations. Now this is very important. you cannot create a rainforest where there should be a desert. There are obvious limitations which are imposed on the target of restoration. The climatic one is particularly important because we have global climate change going on. So forest restoration should not be, strictly speaking, simply an attempt to recreate in every detail the original forest ecosystem. Because if the climate changes, if it gets hotter and wetter or hotter and drier, then the original forest ecosystem is definitely not what we should be trying to put back on these restoration sites. So we have to be aware of not only today's climate and soil limitations, but we need to start to predict maybe what the climatic limitations may be in the future and aim to put back a forest ecosystem that will be able to survive or even thrive under those conditions. So this is a very long, rambling explanation of this definition, and the whole thing, in a nutshell, looks like this. Directing and accelerating ecological succession towards an indigenous forest ecosystem of the maximum biomass, structural complexity, biodiversity, and ecological functioning that are self-sustainable within climatic and soil limitations, and bearing in mind that those limitations may change in the future. So here it is, Ecology 101, the theory of ecological succession. If you take a climax forest or a mature and fully developed and undisturbed forest and you disturb it with a little bit of selective logging, you might go back to a forest which is dominated by more light-loving species, the pioneer species, or you might knock that forest back to a shrubland. If you take away all the trees and do some clear cutting, you might get back to a grassland. If you cultivate the grassland or burn it, you might get back to bare earth. Nature, of course, is always trying to push this system in the opposite direction. It's trying to push the system forward towards the climax forest. So this is called ecological succession or natural regeneration. And before humans became dominant, this system worked very well. But things are a little bit different these days. There are numerous barriers to ecological succession. There's fire, for example, that comes along and burns the grass, and any tree seedlings underneath the grass also get incinerated. So tree seedlings cannot become established. Most of those fires these days are started by human beings, that's for sure. Weeds, also, most of the weed species that we have around, at least here in northern Thailand, are actually exotic species. Many of them have only been here a few decades. So the weeds choking these attempts at trees trying to get re-established in these areas are also a problem. Cattle, of course, coming along and eating those seedlings is also a human problem, and the lack of seeds. Seeds can only be dispersed a fairly limited distance. So if the center of your deforested area is many kilometers from the nearest natural forest, then those seeds simply aren't going to get dispersed into that area. And who chops down the seed trees? Well, again, it's human beings. So there are human created barriers that are simply preventing succession from occurring. And people ask me all the time, they say, Steve, why are you devoting so much of your time towards forest restoration? Why don't you just let nature do its thing and let the forest come back on its own? And the answer is that human beings have put all these barriers in place that now prevent the natural processes of ecological restoration, which were very, very common 200-300 years ago, and which have become progressively hindered by all of these human-related barriers. So, what do? For restoration, we try to remove those barriers and then drive the process of succession forwards at a rate which we hope is faster than nature would be able to manage on her own if all those barriers had remained in place. We're not trying to replace nature, we're trying to remove the human-caused barriers to the natural processes of ecological succession, and then with that liberation, then the process of succession should proceed faster than before. Obviously, the more disturbed the ecosystem has become, the further back in that diagonal line towards the upper left-hand corner of the previous diagram you are, then the harder and the longer you have to work in order to pull that ecosystem towards that target forest condition that you are after. And if you have to do more work, you also have to spend more money. The more degraded the site, the more money you have to spend, the more work you have to do. So it becomes very important to understand at what stage the degradation has reached and then respond to it with the appropriate restoration strategy without wasting money. We believe that there are 6 critical thresholds in this degradation succession sequence which largely determine the particular kind of forest restoration technique that should be applied. 3 of these critical thresholds relate to the actual site where you're going to plant your trees, and 3 of these critical thresholds relate to the landscape which actually surrounds the restoration site. So let's deal with the site factors first. The first one is the first critical point is reached when the sources of forest regeneration fall to critically low levels. Sources of forest restoration include seeds in the soil that remain viable, seedlings, which may be anything from quite tiny to quite large, live tree stumps, that's a good one, because tree stumps are still alive, they have a massive root system, and they can send out new shoots and grow new stems much more quickly than any trees that you can plant. And lastly, there are the large trees, the seed trees. When the numbers of these sources of regeneration falls below some critical value, then you have to rethink your forest restoration strategy. If there are enough of them on the site, then you don't have to plant any trees. So for every source of natural regeneration there is one less tree that you have to plant. The next critical site factor is weed cover. When there is a change from a basic cover of forest crowns to weeds that actually are capable of suppressing the survival and growth of tree seedlings, then obviously you're going to have to do something about the weeds. And the weeding is expensive, so that will push up the cost of your restoration. So are the weeds actually suppressing forest regeneration or not? That's the next critical point. And the last site critical point comes when even the soil is not suitable for the establishment of tree seedlings. If there is erosion, normally this is after fire, after cultivation. It could even be after things like mining, that soil condition or the lack of soil condition prevents tree establishment. So these are three main critical points on the site. If we turn our attention to the landscape, the first critical point in the landscape is insufficient, not enough, seed trees within dispersal distance of the site. Now, if you look at this, this is a typical landscape from northern Thailand, and you see we've got a nice little patch of forest over here. We've got a village over here which is ringed by forest, but then over here we have these very large deforested areas which aren't being used for very much, but they are obviously in danger of erosion. And deep in the valleys where there's a bit more moisture, you've got a little string of forest going down here. Now, it's very difficult to imagine how a seed from the forest over here could actually fall into a deforested site over here. So that would have a seed dispersal limitation. Now, if you have all species able to disperse their seeds into the reforestation site, then you may only have to plant a few species of trees and the rest will come in naturally. But if you have no available seed source within dispersal distance of the restoration site, that means you're going to have to plant all the species of trees, and that's much more expensive. Lack of seed dispersers. Seed sources are no good if there are no seed dispersers available. So if there's heavy hunting in the area and these animals have disappeared, again, you've not got that free natural seed dispersal mechanism going on, and you're going to have to plant all the species rather than just a few of the tree species, and that's going to put your cost up. I've also put fire into the list of landscape risks, because the landscape critical factors, because fire tends to come into these restoration sites from outside. So the amount of fire, the fire risk, is dependent on the amount of fire fuel in the landscape surrounding these restoration sites. If we take these 6 critical factors and put them all together, it becomes possible to recognize 5 stages of degradation, and the stage 1 degradation is light degradation and stage 5 degradation is heavy degradation. And this is a little diagram to pinpoint some of the highlights of stage 1 degradation, which is selective logging. If you look at this site, the trees are still dominating over the weeds, so there's just enough shade from the crowns of the trees to stop the grasses of the imperata and the bracken and the eupatorium from springing up. There's plenty of original seeds left from the original forest in the seed bank and the seedling bank. There's even some intact forest very near to the restoration site, and it is possible that some of those seeds will come on over and be dispersed and establish themselves in the restoration site. We have plenty of seed dispersers, something like the elephant. You see there's even a little elephant back there in the background. Elephants even seem to thrive better in secondary forests than in primary forest. And we've got our bulbuls up here, our smaller seed dispersers, and our medium-sized mammalian seed dispersers. This is meant to be a civet, by the way. What to do with this level of degradation? The answer is, well, not very much. Because all the sources of natural regeneration are still present and their density is high enough to bring about natural forest recovery, protection is all you have to do. Prevent further degradation. That means keep people out of the area. Don't start building roads through these areas try to put up barriers to the dispersal of people into these areas. That will help to reduce the risk of fire, removal of cattle, and it will also help to prevent the hunting of seed dispersers. I mentioned already the importance of maintaining populations of seed dispersers. Moving on to stage 2 degradation, it looks like this. We have some trees remaining, but now the weeds are becoming dominant, and we've reached the point now whereby the weeds are becoming strong enough to actually suppress the growth of the very young tree seedlings. Now we have many sources of natural regeneration. The number that we're looking for is 3,100 per hectare. So there's enough natural regeneration out there, but the problem is that this is now being inhibited in its growth, and the survival is being reduced by the growth of the herbaceous weeds. Intact forest remains within seed dispersal distance of the site. We've lost our elephant, but there's still the smaller seed dispersers on the site. The civet is still there and the bulbuls are still there. The recommended action for this kind of stage of degradation, well, first of all, we still have to do the protection. We still have to prevent the fire, keep out the cattle, and try to deter encroachment, further encroachment as much as possible. But now we have to do something in addition. Protection is not enough because the weeds are suppressing the growth of the trees. So we have to do something called accelerated or assisted natural regeneration, which goes under the acronym ANR. And this method of forest restoration was actually first conceived in the Philippines on, I think it was on Bohol Island. And it's now quite a popular a technique which is being pushed by some major agencies around the world, including the Food and Agriculture Organization. So the main thing about ANR is that you're going to carry out weeding to liberate seedlings which may be growing underneath imperator grasses and other kinds of herbaceous weeds. The technique which was developed and promoted within the Philippines is this technique of what they call lodging the weeds rather than actually cutting the weeds, and it means bending over the grasses and kind of crimping the stalks of the grasses with a wooden board, like you see this chap here doing. Stepping on the wooden board, laying the grasses flat. This is a very effective technique if you have an area that is dominated by soft grasses like imperator. It doesn't work when you have cane grasses like saccharum and thysonolina and so on, because the sturdier cane grasses just tend to spring back after you have stepped on them. It's great. It removes competition for light immediately. The weeds do grow back after a while because the roots are not killed with this method immediately, but then they use up energy resprouting and resprouting, so you have to redo the weed lodging, run out of energy, and the weeds eventually die. It's great because you don't actually disturb the soil. You're not digging up the weeds with a hoe, and it's a little bit safer than doing your weeding with a machete. There's lots of room for injury out there. If you've got 100 villagers out on a hillside all swinging their machetes around. Other things that you can do, well, you can put fertilizer on the young seedlings and encourage their growth. You can put mulching materials around the base. We use a corrugated cardboard here, you can see, and then we dump the grasses that have been cut on top of that. So fertilizer application and mulching, A&R is incredibly efficient and it's cheap if you have a site which has enough sources of natural regeneration. Now, this is one of our A&R experimental sites in Krabi province in southern Thailand. Krabi province has lowland tropical evergreen forest. It's on the border of being an actual tropical rainforest. So trees down there in the south, they grow really quickly. Look at this area. You have sources of natural regeneration all over the place. You even have quite a sturdy tree here, and this tree here is actually producing seeds. So we've got seedlings, we've got saplings, we've got tree stumps. I think this is a tree stump over here. We went along to take these pictures in May of 2007, and on this site we did the weeding. We removed the weeds, especially the vines, the green vines that were, you can see here, choking up everything. We applied fertilizer around these sources of natural regeneration 3 times in the rainy season, and we applied a corrugated cardboard mulch mat also around these trees. May 2007, we did that for about 6 months. By November 2007, the site looked like this. And this was, to me, this was truly amazing. I haven't seen a site recover so quickly with relatively such little work. And there were no trees planted on this site. What you are looking at here is natural forest regeneration, which has been assisted and accelerated by the 3 treatments that I have just mentioned, and it's actually closing canopy by the end of the first rainy season after applying those treatments. Another thing you can do is to encourage natural seed dispersal. This is a bird perch, and our colleagues from King Mongkut's University did this experiment where they put simple bamboo bird perches throughout a deforested area, and then this is the control, which is an area which has been cleared and marked out with stakes, but there is no bird perch in this area. Birds will come and sit on almost anything that you can put out there, and as they do, they drop the seeds of all the other forest trees that they've been eating in the near past. Within a few months, the areas around the perches looked like this, and the red arrows here point to the tops of individual seedlings. So you see this one up here has grown actually taller than the chap who put up the bird perch. I think this is about 1 rainy season's growth. So in summary, accelerated or assisted natural regeneration is very efficient, particularly where natural regeneration is already fairly well advanced. It's cheap because you don't have to grow trees in a nursery and there are no tree planting costs. But it can result in a species poor forest, which is very rich in the pioneer trees, the light-loving, fast-growing pioneer forest tree species which naturally colonize open areas. You might not get the full recovery of biodiversity, including the trees that are characteristic of old mature growth, unless you at a later date start bringing some of those trees in and planting them. But A&I is certainly a very effective way to kickstart natural forest recovery. So moving on to stage 3 degradation, here the weeds are still dominant. Fire risk has gone up because there's more grasses and ground vegetation in the landscape. The critical point we have reached here now is that the number of sources of natural regeneration have dropped below that critical threshold of 3,100 trees per hectare. So not only do we have natural regeneration which is being suppressed by the weed growth, but we don't actually have enough sources of natural regeneration to enable canopy closure to occur by the end of the second rainy season. We do, however, have forest remnants within seed dispersal distance of the site, so natural seed dispersal is still an option here, and our seed dispersers are still alive. Species like these bulbils in the tree that you see in the diagram here, and the civet, they are highly resilient to landscape degradation, and they survive in some really very degraded areas and continue to move seeds around in those landscapes. The recommended action for this kind of degradation, we still have to do the protection. We cannot allow degradation to continue. There will be some sources of natural regeneration that are present, and we need to do the ANR treatments that I've just previously mentioned on those sources of natural regeneration. But that natural regeneration is not going to close canopy now within 2 rainy seasons. And in order to achieve that objective, rapid canopy closure, we need to plant tree species, quite a wide variety of tree species if you want biodiversity recovery to occur. We are calling those tree species framework tree species because in a tropical forest there may be hundreds of tree species, and it's really impractical to try and grow them all in a nursery. So you have to be selective about what tree species you plant at this stage of degradation, and we're calling them framework tree species. So what are framework tree species? They are indigenous forest tree species which have the capability to accelerate natural forest regeneration. They are species with high survival rates and rapid growth rates when they are planted out in the kind of weedy vegetation that you see here in this photograph. So they're highly competitive species. They should also have dense spreading crowns to shade out weeds and what we call recapture the site. Recapturing the site is a critical point in the forest restoration process. It's the point at which tree crown cover begins to exceed ground flora cover. Shade is an extremely effective herbicide, and it has no bad effects on people's health. It's a non-polluting substance, if you like. You can't go and buy it in a hardware store, but you can create it by planting trees that will effectively create shade. The trees should produce something that attracts seed dispersing animals. You're only going to be planting around about 20 to 30 framework tree species, and in the forests where we work there are around 350 tree species. So you're only planting around about 10% of the tree species that should be there. Luckily, in tropical forests, most of the other species are dispersed by animals. So if you can attract those animals to come into your planting site, then the animals will do 90% of the work, will bring in 90% of the species, and you need only plant around about 10% of the tree species that should be there. How do you attract animals? Well, you plant trees that are going to provide something for those animals. It could be food, it could be fruit, or it could be nectar. It might simply be a perching site. I mentioned the artificial bird perches earlier on in connection with ANR. Well, a tree is also a perching point, but a tree not only provides a perching point, it can also attract birds with food as well. So it's you can think of it as a much more efficient bamboo perch of the sort that I've just mentioned. Now, it would be lovely if we could attract the big seed dispersing animals like this elephant here, but unfortunately these the big fauna are extinct, or extirpated I should say, over large parts of their range. So it's not possible to attract the elephants. There aren't any to attract, but we can attract the birds. There's a bulbul pictured here, a fantastic seed dispersing species, and little seed dispersers like this Synopterus fruit bat here. It also helps in a seasonally dry tropical forest area if some of the tree species that are planted are also fairly resilient after fire. Resilience means that these tree species are capable of resprouting from the rootstock, usually from buds around the root collar. It's a process that we call copicing, and some species can do it, but a lot of species can't do it. You see in this photograph here, this is Prunus ceresoides. It's wild cherry species, and this is a seedling that was burned around about 8 months after planting. You can still see some of the black and ash here. This is the original stem here. It's dead, but from the root collar you can see some very healthy sprouts, about 3 or 4 stems coming. And 3 months after pretty much killing all the above ground parts of the tree, you have the potential for a new tree already springing up. So we plant mixtures of pioneer and climax tree species in a single step. In this diagram, the pioneer trees are in blue and the climax trees are in red, just to distinguish them. The pioneer trees grow up very rapidly. That's where most of the biomass accumulation that I was talking about occurs. The pioneer trees are also the ones which flower or fruit early, so they do a lot of the work in attracting wildlife, seed dispersing wildlife. But you notice the climax trees are following the pioneer trees and forming a nice understory here, ready to grow up when the pioneer trees die off. So the pioneer trees, they only have a lifespan of about 25 years, and when they die, there are healthy, mature phase, old growth trees, these climax tree species, ready to take their place. When the seeds brought in by the wildlife germinate, they create a carpet of seedlings, a very diverse carpet of seedlings, and these are the trees that we're really interested in, because these represent far more species than the ones that we've planted. So we have a 3-layer system: pioneer, planted; climax, planted; and then what we call the recruit species. The recruit species are the species that come in after the initial planting. I liken this to fishing. The trees that we plant are the bait on the hook, and the trees that come in under those planted trees are the fish. This is what we're really interested in, because this is natural regeneration, and the purpose of these trees that we've planted up here are simply to encourage that process to occur. And there you are. The original tree species composition of the forest is restored and biodiversity recovered. And implementation of the framework species method is almost routine. This is a typical deforested site where we work in the hills of northern Thailand. You can see that it is it's largely weed covered. There are a few scattered trees up here on the hillsides and a few sources of natural regeneration knocking around. But natural regeneration is a little bit sparse here, so we've got to do some tree planting. So we go out and we plant our framework tree species and set up our experiments. Within 2 years, the forest has closed canopy, and you're beginning to get the feel that a forest is developing. The key to this, I mean, there's really three main factors that contribute to this kind of success. The first is that you have to have the right species. You have to select these critical framework tree species, and you have to find out what they are. You have to trawl through your native tree flora in your indigenous forest, find out what the framework species are for that particular forest. Then you have to create planting stock in the nursery of the highest possible quality. That means they have to be the right size when they're planted out, between 30 and 50 centimeters. And lastly, you do have to take care of the trees quite intensively in the first 2 rainy seasons after they are planted. That includes weeding around the trees in our case, every approximately 6 weeks, and the application of fertilizer. We like to use an organic fertilizer for that. And of course, you have to protect the trees from fire. If you are in a seasonally dry area, you can lose everything in a few minutes if you don't surround the area with fire breaks. But if you do all of that, you can expect results like this. And in 8.5 years, we now have something which has very much the look and feel of a young indigenous forest ecosystem. You can see on the ground there's almost no weeds. The weeds have been completely eliminated. We have the development of an understory here, and you can see in the background here all this greenery. And then you've got the tall pioneer trees that are these stems here, and on the ground, not too prominent in this photograph, there are seedlings of plenty of native forest trees which we haven't planted but which have been brought in by the animals. This is another plot. You notice the big black tree stump on the right here. This is before we planted. We planted 29 framework tree species in this plot. After 1 year, you can see the trees already have developed crowns that are poking up above the weed canopy. And then after 9 years, the area looks like this. There is the original black tree stump from the original forest. And you can see a nice, thick, almost impenetrable forest is springing up on this area. And after 11 years, you've got some really quite large trees now. I think these are macarangas. And it's really very much taking on the look and feel of a tropical forest. Return of structure. Well, I got my students to do a transect through this 6-year-old plot, and this is what it looks like. And it really does reflect the little cartoon diagram that I showed you earlier. Here are the pioneer trees. S stands for spondias, and M is a magnolia, N is a nyssa. And then beneath that, you have the more shade-tolerant climax trees. We've got a Bischoffia and Quercus and a couple of other things. So the return of structure is a very real and very rapid phenomenon. We monitored the trees for their provision of flowers, fruits, or bird nesting sites, and we found that 44 species are among those. This covers various experiments over many years. 44 of the tree species that we tested in various plots at various times provided resources such as flowers, fruits and bird nesting sites within 7 years after planting, and we had 14 species, what we call our super framework species, which did so within 3 years. And when you're producing resources like this is the wild cherry, this is the prunus. So the fruits are coming in 3 years, and birds are coming in and nesting in this tree also within 3 years. This is an example of the sort of resources that the planted framework tree species survives. Those kinds of resources certainly in our experiments attracted bird species from other areas of the landscape. When we began the project, we did a survey of birds in the area, and we found 30 species, only 30 species, which is pretty low for a tropical area. And after 6 years after planting, we did another survey and we found 87 bird species. So the number of bird species almost trebled as a result of the forest restoration program. This represents 2/3 of the bird community of the nearest natural forest. So within 6 years, you have more than 60% of the birds which are characteristic of mature forest coming back into these restored areas. People ask me, Steve, when do you know that you've finished doing the restoration? And there isn't really a definitive finishing point to these experiments, but the way I reply to that question is, if 2/3 of the bird species that normally live in mature primary forest think that the forest we have restored is a good home for them, and if they're happy with the forest that we've grown, then I'm also happy with the forest. So let the birds decide whether or not they think this is a decent forest or not. And all of these mammals come in. We've got pangolins, very much increase in pangolins in the area, so much so that unfortunately now the villagers are collecting a few and eating them. We've got hog badger, barking deer have gone up, and the large Indian civet, the wonderful seed disperser, is back, and wild pigs have increased as well. We set up some camera traps in our plots, and these are some of the pictures that we've got. This is the large Indian civet, and here are the feces of the large Indian civet, and you can clearly see seeds, some quite large seeds in these feces. They are fantastic seed dispersers, and they disperse seeds over at least 10 kilometers, because we had tree species coming up in our plots which don't grow anywhere near our plots. So we know they're coming in from a minimum of 10 kilometers away. And this is the hog badger. The hog badger actually breeds in the plots. We found a mother with 2 cubs in a plot that was just 3 years old. Barking deer also come back in, but like I just said, where there's wildlife, there's hunting. So it's just as important to try to control the hunting or prevent the hunting as it is to plant the trees. With framework tree species, we are trying to attract wildlife by planting trees that produce something to attract that wildlife. There's no point in planting trees to attract wildlife if there's no wildlife left to attract, and that's why it's so important to prevent hunting. The wildlife, like I said, wildlife are planting up to 90% of the final community of tree species that will grow up, and the 20 or 30 framework tree species is only 10%. So they're doing a fantastic job, and they don't demand a monthly salary for the tree planting activities that they do. So it makes economic sense not to kill these animals. And in our experiments, we certainly, so the next question is, all these animals coming in, do they actually plant additional recruit species, and the work of one of my master's students, Kimim Sinhaseni, in 2008. She did a very nice project on that, and we planted 30 framework tree species in this area, and we got 72 additional recruit species coming up within 8 to 9 years over which she did her study. So if you take the 30 that we planted and the 72 that came in, you end up with 102 tree species coming up in this area. Moving on to degradation stage 4. With this stage of degradation, we have weeds dominating. We've now, the new critical point is that we've reached the point at which there is no forest left within the landscape. So we've lost our source of seeds. Our free seed dispersal service is gone because there are effectively few or no seed dispersers left in the landscape. We have few or no sources of natural regeneration, and the fire risk has also gone up. Under these circumstances, planting framework tree species to attract wildlife won't work because there aren't any seed sources within dispersal distance of the site, and the animals aren't there to attract. Under this situation, you have to plant everything, and it's very, very expensive to do that. These are what we call the maximum diversity methods, planting all the species and sometimes doing some manipulation of the soil as well, but that's more on that in stage 5. The most famous maximum diversity planting method is something called the Miyawaki Method, which was developed by Professor Akira Miyawaki, who's from Japan. I call this approach Xerox forestry because what you're trying to do is actually copy the original forest in one step. It's not possible with this technique to manipulate natural succession, really. You're just trying to drop back the entire forest ecosystem in one step. There's Professor Miyawaki up here. He's about 80, I think he's well into his 80s now, but he's a man full of energy. He's not only a genius when it comes to the understanding of the reconstruction of plant communities, but he's also a financial genius because he's managed to persuade many of the large corporations in Japan to actually finance this kind of forestry. It is extremely expensive to do this. This is one of his original sites. It's actually on a university campus. I think it's Yokohama University campus in Japan. And you see this side here is actually that forest there. So, you know, the Miyawaki method is very effective. It is incredibly intensive. He recommends planting 20 to 30,000 trees per hectare. It's a very, very high number of trees, which results in them being only around 60 centimeters apart. Now that is to achieve an extremely rapid canopy closure, but if all the trees survive, you have an almost impenetrable forest with this method. And of course it's very expensive. It's upwards of nearly 10,000 US dollars per hectare to do it this way. So this technique is so expensive and so intensive, it's really only suitable if the land on which you are doing it has very, very high value. So it's done in urban areas. The big companies, the Toyota project was done restoring forest around an actual Toyota car factory. I mean, mainly to kind of hide the car factory from people going past on the road and so on. So it's more like urban gardening than actual restoration of forest ecosystems on a large scale on open mountainsides. And the last point is it really does not depend on natural ecological services. I mentioned two services really: natural regeneration, sources of natural regeneration featured in A&R, and the free service of natural seed dispersal featured in what I was saying about the framework species technique. This technique really does not depend on these natural services, and it replaces them with intensive horticultural care and simply planting more trees. So moving on now to stage 5, degradation. Excuse me. At stage 5 degradation, the next critical point that we've reached is that the soil is beginning to break down. The soil ecosystem is beginning to break down. There are no seed sources in the natural landscape. There are few or no sources of natural regeneration, and even the weeds have a hard time. So the critical factor now is significant degradation of the soil ecosystem. And this is the kind of site that we are talking about. These mining sites, open cast mines, are a classic example of stage 5 degradation. With these kinds of sites, you have to work on improving the soil first. You can't just go into these sites and do maximum diversity planting or framework species planting. It just really doesn't work. Most of the trees will die in the soil conditions, in the poor soil conditions. So we're looking for nurse trees to create what we call a foster ecosystem. The function of the foster ecosystem is to improve the soil, and later on these nurse trees can be thinned out, and then you can come in with your maximum diversity plantings once the soil has improved. There are two groups of tree species that we are particularly interested in with this stage 5 degradation. The first group are the legumes. Legumes because they fix nitrogen. They fix nitrogen in their leaves, and when those leaves they actually fix nitrogen in root nodules. The nitrogen is used to make protein. When the leaves with those proteins in them fall into the soil, the nitrogen goes back into the soil. So legumes are a great way to increase the nutrient status of the soil. And many legume species are very hardy and are actually capable of growing in these very highly degraded situations. Another extremely hardy species that will even grow on rock. Here you see Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and there's a big fig tree growing here. These roots will penetrate all kinds of cracks and crevices, and as they expand, they actually start to break up the soil. They are great mechanism for soil creation from rock or concrete. So fig trees for improving soil structure, and legume trees for dealing with the soil chemistry or nutrient status. You could even consider at this stage planting fast-growing exotic species if they have some of these properties. If they would also be able to maybe produce some kind of cash-generating product that may benefit local people, because this kind of restoration is extremely expensive, and it's nice if you can plant something that will yield an economic benefit early on. So those are the definitions of the 5 stages of degradation and the names of the techniques that are applied to each of those 5 stages. They're quite easy to recognize in the field, and the first thing that you should do if you're considering a restoration program is to go out and survey the area, survey the surrounding landscape, and figure out which stage of degradation you are at. First of all, the landscape critical thresholds. These are quite easy to do. The best way to do this is to team up with a bunch of local villagers and go on a little walkabout tour of the landscape, find a viewpoint and have a look at the landscape with a pair of binoculars, you can quite easily see if there's any fragments of mature forest that could act as seed sources in the landscape, and whether you think they're close enough to the restoration site to be able to deliver some seeds of some of the other native tree species into your restoration site. Fire history, again, the local people will know if it burns regularly in the area or if fires are a rarity. Seed dispersers are mostly nocturnal. We saw the, for example, the civet that we saw, and the bat. They're nocturnal, so you're not going to see them. So why not just ask the local people if they see them running across the road when they're driving their cars back home late at night? That's often the best way to determine whether you have enough seed dispersers in the area. So a little bit of a field trip and a consultation with the local people is probably enough to determine the situation with regard to the critical thresholds at the landscape level. On the site that you're going to plant, it's a good idea to actually get onto the site and do some sampling. And the sample unit that we use is the circle of diameter 10 meters. So you make a piece of string 5 meters long and you put in a pole and you walk round in a circle, and then you've got a circle of 10 meters diameter, and within that circle you record the sources of natural regeneration and you count them, and if possible you get the local people to give them some names, or you take a botanist along and get some proper scientific names. This is what we record in these circles. We're looking for barriers to succession. We look for signs of cattle dung, or perhaps damage to young trees by cattle nibbling at the branches. We look for signs of fire, black ash or charcoal in the soil. We look at the weeds. Are the weeds really tall and really thick? Are they likely to be suppressing the growth of tree seedlings? Or are the weeds low and not very dense and not likely to threaten the growth of trees? And lastly, we look at the soil. Again, this can be done by simply asking local people the simple question, would you grow your crops in this soil? If the answer is no, then you may have a problem with soil. And then you can look for obvious signs of soil erosion. You can note down if there are exposed rocks or if you actually begin to see the start of erosion gully formation. Then you're going to count the numbers of regenerants. A regenerant is any source of natural regeneration, but not including seeds, because obviously you can't count all the seeds in the soil. So you're looking for the number of seed trees. These are large trees, more than 30 centimeters in girth. Seedlings or saplings, which are, we have a cutoff limit of 50 centimeters tall. Anything 50 centimeters or taller is counted. Tree stumps with coppicing, which I mentioned earlier. And then we also try to count the species, the numbers of different species. Now there is a standard form for doing one of these surveys. It's in the book, so you can download it from the internet. We like to do a minimum of 10 circles, and then you just fill in the data across the line. Livestock signs, yes or no. Signs of fire, yes or no. The soil, the percent of the exposure of the soil, the condition of the soil according to the villagers, and whether or not you have erosion of the soil visible. And then weeds, the cover of weeds, the height of the weeds. You're interested really here in whether or not the weeds are taller than the seedlings that are growing in the plot. If the weeds are taller than the seedlings, you've got a problem with the weeds and you're going to have to do something about the weed situation. If the trees are actually growing up above the weeds, then you probably don't have to do any weeding, and that makes the restoration cheaper. The number of trees which are taller than 50 centimeters but smaller than 30 centimeters girth at breast height, the number of live tree stumps that are coppicing, and the number of trees larger than 30 centimeters girth at breast height. And then this column, you total up the number of natural regenerants, all three of them. And so you get a total down here. This is the number of natural regenerants. Just a second. This is the number of natural regenerants in 10 circles, 208. So there's a mean of 20.8 natural regenerants in each circle. The circles are 78 square meters, and a hectare is 10,000 square meters. So if you multiply it up, you get a estimated figure of 2,667 regenerants per hectare, and that means you're aiming for 3,100 regenerants per hectare on average. And so subtract this from this, and you get the number of trees that you're going to have to plant per hectare. Now, you can also look at the numbers of species. We had 18 species of natural regenerant in this particular survey. 16 were pioneers, 2 were climax shade-tolerant species. So we're aiming for about 30 species. So we've got 18. We've already got 16 pioneers. So really the rest of them, we need about 12 climax species to put in 12 climax species to plant in this area. We've got 12 species to plant. We need to plant 433 trees per hectare, and therefore if you take 433 divided by 12, it gives you the number of trees of each species that you should plant in the area. This kind of survey, it can be done in half a day. If you have maybe half a dozen villagers to help with this kind of survey, always involve the local people in doing this kind of survey. They need to see what's going on, and they need to be closely involved in the planning procedures for any restoration program. It takes about half a day to do 10 circles. Initial restoration activities should aim to maintain or increase the number of regenerants up to 3,100 per hectare. Why 3,100? Well, from our work in northern Thailand, we have found that on average the trees that we plant expand their crown by 1.8 meters in 2 rainy seasons. That means you have to plant the trees about, on average, over a whole hectare. They need to be planted approximately 1.8 meters apart to guarantee some kind of canopy closure by the end of the second rainy season. If you take that spacing 1.8 meters apart for each tree, it means you can fit in 3,100 trees per hectare. If your trees are likely to grow faster and their tree crowns are likely to expand more quickly, then you can plant fewer trees. But if you're in a very dry area where tree growth is likely to be even slower, then maybe you need to consider planting the trees a little bit closer together. So your number 3,100 might vary. It'll be lower in wetter areas and it'll be higher in drier areas. You want to maintain or increase the number of tree species represented by regenerants to a minimum of approximately 10% of the tree species richness of the target forest ecosystem. The problem is you might not know the total number of species in the target forest ecosystem, and therefore you might not know what is 10% of that value. Generally speaking, however, in most individual forest types in Southeast Asia, you're looking at between 250 and 350 tree species overall. So a value of between 20 and 30 tree species as the number of initial framework tree species that you plant is probably quite reasonable. And as a rough rule of thumb, go for 20 to 30 species and you can't really go wrong. And the last thing, the number 3, initial restoration activities should aim to counteract the factors that impede forest regeneration. So if you are recording fire in all of your circles, you need to cut a fire break. If you are recording cattle dung in each of your 10 circles, then you need to talk to the villagers about restricting access to the area by domestic animals. And if you are not finding seed dispersing animals in your landscape, you need to perhaps run an anti-hunting campaign amongst the local people. What are the costs? Well, protection alone is maybe a few $100s per hectare. ANR varies. One published estimate was $500, and another published estimate was about $2,400. So it depends what you read. Framework species technique that we use in Thailand is about $2,000 per hectare. The maximum diversity technique, there's a paper from South America that puts this at about $9,000, and there's another one that has costed the Miyawaki method at $10,000 per hectare. And for stage 5 degradation, I don't know what the cost is because you can't get that information from the mining companies. They're very reluctant to part with it. Generally speaking, there's very little information in published materials about how much people are spending on forest restoration. But generally speaking, you can see the cost goes up. As the stage of degradation goes up, the cost certainly goes up. So it makes sense not to chop the forest down in the first place because it's cheaper to do protection than it is to do the kind of full planting that is recommended by Professor Miyawaki. And these are the references for those figures. But you know what? We shouldn't just talk about the costs of forest restoration. We should also talk about the benefits. The ultimate economic value of the benefits of restoring a climax forest ecosystem in terms of ecological services and diversity of forest products are the same, regardless of whether you are starting with stage 1 degradation or stage 5 degradation. You're still going to get back to a mature forest ecosystem, and that mature forest ecosystem is worth $6,000 per hectare per year. These figures comes from a study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity study. You can look it up online. Here is the website here. And this is a project which brought together, I think it was about 180 experts and scientists from around the world, reviewing the literature and collaborating on writing a document that will actually put a value on all of these things. So they reckon $75 worth of food, $143 worth of water, and so on and so on. You can read this at your leisure, but I want to point out the two big ones: climate regulation, sequestration of carbon, nearly $2,000 per hectare per year, and water flow regulation, the prevention of floods, $1,300 per hectare per year. Now, the problem with these studies is nobody is currently making $6,120 per hectare per year from forest restoration. And the reason is that in order to gain access to this income, you need to invest money and you need to develop the market for these products. At the moment here in Thailand, we don't have a market. There is no official market for carbon credits, so we can't claim this kind of money. And if you take recreation and ecotourism, well, yeah, sure, ecotourists like to go into the forest and watch birds, but in order to cater for those ecotourists, you need to build an ecotour lodge, you need to train the staff to actually work the ecotourist lodge. So for this kind of income, you need additional investment, and you need to develop markets. Take water, for example, $143 worth of water flowing out from the forest. Who's going to pay for that water? How are you going to persuade people to pay money for these things when the psychology of people means that they view anything coming from the forest as being effectively free, or they think it should be free? Well, under some circumstances, we do already pay a great deal more money than usual for water. If Evian can persuade us to pay $5 for a bottle of water at the airport, can't these advertising folk persuade people to also buy carbon credits and also to invest in ecotourism and develop markets for forest products of one kind or another? It's funny, but the future of forests and forest restoration may actually lie in the hands of advertising executives, because they are the clever ones that can persuade us to buy all these different products that we don't really need. The economic elegance of the forest restoration model is that it generates many different types of income, many different income streams that are shared amongst a very wide range of stakeholders. So if the market price of one product or service falls, another one can be developed to maintain overall profitability. So if the price of carbon credits goes down, then you look for opportunities to sell the water to the nearest municipality, and if the price of water goes down, then perhaps you market some more of the forest products, the foods and the gums and the resins and all of that. It's a good insurance system. If you're investing in the stock market, you don't just buy one stock or one share. You buy a variety, and that's the way we should be thinking about these forests. They are a hedge against future economic downturns. Forest restoration is no longer just the pipe dream of a few conservationists. It could well become a highly lucrative global industry, and one day, I mean already, I would say, money really does grow on trees. So don't forget, this is our website. If you want the book, the PDFs are available from here, and you can order it from Q Publishing if you want to hold a physical copy. I'm Stephen Elliott from the Forest Restoration Research Unit of Chiang Mai University. Thank you for listening.